My teeth shall sparkle.
Indeed, your majesty.
There are ages in history that wear a mask. They glitter. They shine. They call themselves golden, and yet, beneath the surface, something decays. The Elizabethan era, stretching from the year 1558 to 1603, is often remembered as one such age, a time of Shakespeare, of seafaring heroes, of regal tapestries and poetic speeches. But if you dare to peel back the velvet curtain, what you'll find isn't just the splendor of Queen Elizabeth I's court. You'll find blackened teeth, bleeding corpses used as legal witnesses, plague doctors with faces like birds, and a society so terrified of invisible forces that superstition ruled louder than science. And it all began with a smile, a smile rotted down to its roots. In the court of Good Queen Bess, sugar was the king's ransom, imported from colonies far beyond the seas. This white gold found its way into every corner of elite life. They stirred it into vegetables, molded it into edible statues, baked it into gingerbread and rose-scented cubes, and worst of all, rubbed it directly onto their teeth as if it could cure decay. It could not. Elizabeth herself was infamous for her sweet tooth, and by the final years of her reign, her once powerful smile had become a decaying wreck of black stumps and empty spaces. The irony was cruel. The richer you were, the more ruin you invited into your mouth. And soon, rot became fashionable. The poor, desperate to seem refined, began blackening their teeth with soot and charcoal, hoping to fake the glamour of aristocratic decay. In this twisted version of beauty, the worse your smile, the higher your status. But sugar wasn't the only illusion. Medicine in this so-called enlightened age was more performance than practice. No one truly understood germs or contagion. Diseases were blamed on the air itself, invisible mists of poison called miasmas that crept through cities, slipping under doorways and wrapping around throats like curses. And so, in a desperate attempt to outwit death, doctors dressed like nightmares. They wore long robes, gloves, wide-brimmed hats, and most famously, masks shaped like the heads of birds. These beaked masks were stuffed with herbs, dried flowers, and perfumed cloth, all in the vain hope that sweet smells could counteract the bad air. They prowled the streets of London like omens, more terrifying than the plague itself. They bled the sick with leeches, bathed them in vinegar, whispered prayers, and watched most of them die anyway. And yet, the plague came back, again and again. While the doctors played dress-up with death, the courts of Elizabethan England were no less theatrical. Here, law and superstition danced hand in hand. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, the accused might be forced to undergo a ritual called cruentation, an ancient practice where the corpse of the alleged victim was laid out, and the accused was ordered to touch it. If the body bled even a single drop, it was taken as divine proof of guilt. They believed that the dead could still see, still know, and still cry out for justice. Shakespeare himself referenced the belief in Henry VI, writing of a dead man's wounds that open their congealed mouths and bleed afresh. To modern eyes, it sounds absurd, but in Elizabeth's England, this was a courtroom standard. Justice was not about evidence or reason. It was about performance, faith, and fear. And speaking of fear, none were more feared than witches, with a kingdom caught between religious wars, failed crops, disease outbreaks, and unexplained illness. Someone had to be blamed, and it was often women. Women who knew herbs, women who spoke boldly, women with birthmarks, or stray cats, or strange dreams. They were tied, judged, and hanged, not burned, as in later American trials, but hanged all the same. Queen Elizabeth's own mother, Anne Boleyn, had a sixth finger and was whispered to be a witch. Perhaps it was this lingering memory that led Elizabeth to enact stricter witch laws than ever before. While still forbidding torture and distancing the church from trials, it was a strange balance, harsher rules, but a more restrained hand. Still, many innocent women died, and still, the fear never truly faded. What made the Elizabethan era so disturbing wasn't just the rot, the rituals, or the reeking death in the streets. It was the contradiction. Here was a society that celebrated the arts, that gave the world its greatest playwright, that dressed in silk and velvet and recited poetry under the stars. And yet, it was a world where fashion came from illness, where corpses could be called to testify, where medicine was costume, and where every breath could carry your death. They called it progress. But in truth, it was a beautiful mask painted in sugar, stitched with superstition, and rotting underneath. And perhaps the most chilling thought of all is this: they didn't think it was strange. They thought it was normal. Just as we think our ways are normal today, just as someone, centuries from now, may one day look back at us and shudder. So if you feel safe in the knowledge that you live in a modern, reasonable age, think again. The people of the 16th century believed the same, and somewhere, in the dark corners of their history, a corpse may still be bleeding. It always begins with the mouth, a place of words, of whispers, of smiles meant to disarm and flatter, to declare power or conceal weakness. But in the grand court of Queen Elizabeth I, it was also the first thing to rot. Behind the lace collars and the velvet sleeves, beyond the ornate mirrors and golden goblets, what truly betrayed the sickness of an era was hidden just beneath the lips of every nobleman and lady, teeth, so blackened they gleamed with decay. Each one a badge of pride, not shame. And in this world of twisted elegance, the darker your smile, the higher your station. For what would a peasant know of sugar? That luxury imported across oceans, and sweet enough to purchase the illusion of health, even as it carved its name into your bones and gums. Sugar, they said, was a gift from the colonies, a miracle of trade, a white treasure that could be poured over meats, blended into fruits, sculpted into roses, and offered as tribute to the crown in the form of gingerbread men and rosewater cubes. But in truth it was an addiction in silk robes, an opiate of the elite, and none were more devoted than Queen Elizabeth herself, who, by the twilight of her reign, had a mouth that bore no resemblance to majesty, only to ruin. Her teeth, once white like pearls in her youth, had blackened with time and indulgence, and the legend goes that she could scarcely speak without her words echoing through the empty gaps of teeth long since surrendered to sweetness. And yet no one dared to flinch, no one dared to recoil. Instead, they imitated her. For that is the thing about fashion. In a court obsessed with appearances, it does not rise from logic, nor does it bow to health. It simply imitates the throne. And so the ladies and gentlemen of the gentry, eager to appear refined, began to blacken their own teeth deliberately, rubbing soot, charcoal, and even crushed coal into their gums to mimic the royal decay. This was not vanity, this was allegiance. A declaration that said, I too am among the chosen, even if it meant smiling through ash and pretending the sweetness didn't sting. To smile brightly was to risk exposure, to risk being mistaken for one of the lower classes, whose clean teeth betrayed a life without sugar, a life without status. And so the poor burned their mouths to appear rich, and the rich burned theirs without shame. But it was more than just sugar. It was belief. In those days, the line between science and superstition was barely visible, a faint crack in the stained glass window of faith. And so people genuinely believed that sugar, yes, sugar could protect the body, could heal it, could prevent decay rather than cause it. They would rub sugar on their teeth as if it were a balm, a sacred offering to ward off disease. And though their mouths turned black and their breath reeked of infection, they clung to this illusion, like a rosary, whispering to themselves that sweetness was a sign of salvation, not suffering. Dentistry, of course, was a nightmare unto itself. There were no toothbrushes as we know them now. No fluoride, no understanding of bacteria or enamel. The tools of the trade were crude, the barbers doubling as surgeons, and pain was the only certainty. A decaying tooth was not treated, it was yanked. An abscess was not drained with care, it was cut open, often with dirty hands and no sedation. Infection followed like a shadow, and death by toothache was not poetic exaggeration but a bitter truth. And yet, no one questioned the cause. They blamed spirits. They blamed imbalance. They blamed fate. Never the sugar. Never the queen. In portraits from the time, artists avoided painting open mouths. The smiles were closed, the lips tight, the jaws strong but secretive. It was not modesty. It was protection. To reveal one's teeth was to reveal one's class, one's indulgences, one's slow and sugary death. And behind the painted lips of every noble portrait lurked a story of decay, a rot born not from neglect, but from excess. Among the common people, the contrast was cruel. They could not afford sugar, nor the fashionable afflictions it brought. Their teeth, though healthier by accident, became targets of ridicule. A clean mouth was seen as suspicious, too plain, too unpolished, too unworthy of the courtly disease. So they mimicked. They stained their teeth with soot from the hearth, painted on shadows of rot just to be left alone. In an era where health was mocked and disease was envied, truth had no place. This culture of decay seeped into everything. Children of noble birth were raised on sweetened gruels and candied fruits, taught that sugar was nourishment, not poison. Courtiers gifted one another boxes of sweets, each more elaborate than the last, their shapes moulded into swans, castles, and even crowns. But beneath the beauty was a trap, and with every bite, they fed not just their hunger, but the slow erosion of their own bodies. It was a feast for the grave. Even in death, the sugar clung to them. Their breath smelled of rot. Their gums bled without provocation. And in the cold of the tomb, their teeth, black as obsidian, remained long after flesh and fabric had crumbled. It is said that when the bodies of nobles were exhumed centuries later, the teeth were the first thing to reveal the truth. Not a life of elegance, but a life of ruin, rotting from the inside out. And yet, for all the horror it caused, sugar never lost its throne. It remained a symbol of power, a whispered code of wealth, an offering passed from hand to hand beneath the chandeliers of white marble halls. It was the taste of empire, sweet, deadly, and dressed in gold leaf. So when you look at the paintings from that age, at the soft curls of the Queen's wig, at the intricate embroidery of her collar, at the delicate tilt of her chin, remember what lies beneath. Remember the smile she dared not show. Remember the sweetness that destroyed her from within. And remember, too, that a society can dress its disease in diamonds and still call it divine. In the end, the mouth does not lie. It decays. And in the court of Queen Elizabeth I, every blackened tooth was a truth too terrible to speak. When the air turned foul and death crept in through the cracks beneath the doors, when the bells tolled for the sick and the windows slammed shut in panic, the people of Elizabethan England did not call upon angels, nor did they whisper prayers to saints alone. They called upon the men in black, the masked figures who walked through the shadow of plague like omens carved from nightmare, cloaked head to toe in dark robes, gloved hands, pale and trembling, wide-brimmed hats shading their hollow eyes. And most disturbingly of all, faces hidden behind masks shaped like the curved beak of a carrion bird, as if death itself had grown feathers and learned to walk upright among the dying. They were the plague doctors. And though the name conjures images of healing and knowledge, these men were not healers in the way we now understand it, but rather messengers of finality. Creepiest, part undertaker, part misguided scientist, wandering figures of desperation wrapped in leather. Their grotesque masks stuffed with dried herbs, leonda, mint, rose petals, and camphor, all intended to protect them not from germs, which they did not understand, but from the invisible force they believed caused illness, the miasma, the bad air, the wicked stench of corruption that rose from rotting bodies, open zevers, and breathless coughs. A vapor they imagined could slide down your throat and nest in your lungs like a curse. And so they came dressed not for comfort, not for efficiency, but for survival, wrapped in costumes that made them sweat and suffocate, that muffled their senses and distorted their voices into something neither human nor holy. They looked like demons summoned from the fever dreams of the sick. And when they entered homes, if they dared enter at all, it was not to bring comfort but to observe, to prod, to bleed, to burn, to diagnose according to theories drawn not from medicine but from manuscripts passed between men who had never touched a corpse, who had never witnessed how fast the skin turned black, or how quickly the lymph swelled like grapes of agony under the arms, who believed that to balance the body was to cut it open and let the sickness drain out like wine from a cracked barrel. Bloodletting was common, almost ritual. The theory, if one could call it that, insisted that illness came from imbalance, too much blood, too much bile, too much phlegm, and that only by releasing the excess could the body find harmony again. And so veins were opened, leeches applied, and the sick, already weakened, were bled into silence. If they died, it was God's will. If they survived, the doctor claimed victory, though it was often not his doing. But the stubborn mercy of nature, others were bathed in vinegar, doused with boiling herbs, or smoked with sulfur and tar, all in the hope of driving out the invisible demons, believed to cling to skin and soul. Some doctors carried canes not just for walking but for prodding patients from a distance, too afraid to touch the infected flesh with their hands. Others refused to speak directly to the ill, fearing that even words might carry contagion. And in the chaos of it all, records blurred, names vanished, and bodies piled faster than prayers could keep up. The streets, once lively with markets and music, fell silent. Horses dragged carts of corpses through alleys where children no longer played. Red crosses marked doors where entire families had fallen, their final cries muffled by wood and fear. And through it all, the beaked masks moved slowly, deliberately, pausing to take pulse, to scribble on parchment, to mutter Latin under their breath. They were both witness and warning. Where they walked, death was never far behind. It is said that in some towns, people locked themselves indoors the moment a beaked figure appeared at the end of the street, fearing that to even glimpse such a man was to invite the plague into your lungs. Children cried, dogs barked, windows shuttered, and when the doctor moved on, the silence he left behind felt heavier than his presence. He was not salvation. He was a sign, and yet, the people clung to him, because what else was there? The church could offer last rites, but no cure. The magistrates could pass laws, but not immunity. And so, with trembling hope, they allowed these ghostly figures into their homes, praying that the bag of herbs, the vial of vinegar, or the sharpened knife might somehow make the difference between life and the shallow grave waiting just beyond the city wall. There were, of course, no real victories. The plague, likely the bubonic plague, spread by fleas hidden in the fur of rats, cared little for herbs or prayers. It moved quickly, cruelly, invisibly, leaving swollen black buboes in its wake, filling lungs with fluid until breath became a drowning, and collapsing the body from within in just a matter of days. No mask could stop it. No beak could sniff it out. And though the plague doctors tried, though they walked with courage through the very pits of pestilence, most of them died, just like the patients they sought to save. Some say the beaked mask was more than just a filter. It was a ritual, a psychological shield against the madness of mass death. To become the bird was to escape being human. To wear the beak was to become the hunter, not the hunted. And in a way, they were right. The mask made it possible to endure, to stare into 1,000 faces of fear and not flinch, to see mothers weep over children, and children over fathers, and to keep walking, to keep working, and then, just as quickly as it came, the plague would vanish, retreating into silence until the next wave, the next ship, the next rat. The doctors would hang up their masks, bury their dead, and disappear into the annals of history, their names forgotten, their failures quietly erased. But the image remained. The long coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the hollow black eyes, the curved beak. It lingered in art, in rumor, in story. It re-emerged in carnivals and costume balls, transformed from symbol of death into mask of mystery. It crept into nightmares and history books. Always half truth, half myth. And now, Century la Terre, when we see it, when we look into the empty sockets of that bird's face, we do not see hope. We see a warning. That sometimes knowledge comes too late. That sometimes fear wears a uniform. And that once upon a time, in a city shrouded in smoke and silence, the doctors looked like birds, and no one was saved. There are nights when a kingdom trembles not because of armies or plague, but because of whispers. And in Elizabethan England, whispers were as deadly as daggers, curling through the smoke of taverns, slipping under the doors of cottages, coiling up the spiral staircases of castles until they reached the ear of a magistrate or a priest. And in those whispers a woman's name could turn into a curse, a birthmark into a bargain with the devil, an herbal remedy into a crime. For this was an age that dressed superstition in robes of law and called it justice, and the rope that hanged a healer could be braided from nothing more than rumor. It was not difficult to fall under suspicion. A midwife who knew how to ease childbirth pains with plants, a widow who collected wildflowers at dusk, a girl whose cat would not leave her side, a neighbor whose milk curdled. Any of these could be enough to bring an accusation, and in a world where the line between faith and fear blurred like ink in rain, the accusation itself was almost a sentence. England had endured decades of religious violence before Elizabeth came to power, Catholic against Protestant, neighbour against neighbour, and though her reign from the year 1558 to 1603 brought a relative calm to the battlefield, the hunger for scapegoats did not die. It simply changed its face. And so came the witches. In pamphlets and sermons they were described as hags, with crooked backs and taloned hands. But in reality they were often poor women, older women, or simply women who lived alone. To know the properties of herbs was suspicious. To heal a child's fever without a priest was dangerous. To mutter a prayer that was not in Latin could mark you as a consort of the devil. When a harvest failed, or a cow died, or an infant sickened, blame ran downhill until it reached the most powerless. Witchcraft became the net in which society caught its fears. Queen Elizabeth herself walked a strange line in this darkness. She signed into law harsher anti-witchcraft statutes than any before her, declaring it a felony to practice sorcery or consult spirits. Yet she also forbade torture and refused to define witchcraft as heresy, thereby keeping the church courts from dragging suspects into dungeons of confession and fire. In an age where the flames of the Inquisition still burned abroad, this was a kind of mercy. Though a grim one, English witches were not burned at the stake, as in continental Europe or later in America. They were hanged. A rope instead of a pyre. It was a slower death perhaps, but a cleaner one. And in this faint concession of cruelty, there was an echo of the Queen's own shadowed past. For Elizabeth's mother, Enid Boleyn, had herself been whispered about in tones of witchcraft. She was accused of seducing King Henry VIII with sorcery, of bearing a child marked by deformity, of having an extra finger, a sixth finger on one hand that some swore they saw and others denied. Whether it existed or not, the rumour became a weapon, part of the machinery that condemned her to death. Anne was beheaded when Elizabeth was only a child, and though the Queen rarely spoke of it, the memory of her mother's fall must have lingered like a bruise in her mind. How could it not? When courtiers still whispered about her lineage behind painted fans, when her enemies called her the daughter of a witch in secret, it is perhaps no coincidence then that Elizabeth, while strengthening the laws against sorcery, also built barriers around the worst abuses. She knew how easily a rumour could destroy. She knew that to be different, to be clever, to be inconvenient, could be enough to end you. And so her reign became a paradox. The law was harsher, but the trials were less bloody. The rhetoric was fierce. But the gallows replaced the stake. It was still injustice, but of a cooler kind, as if the Queen were trying to balance her own kingdom's hunger for superstition with a memory of what that hunger had done to her family. Yet for those accused, mercy was a word that lost its meaning. To be taken under suspicion was to step onto a stage where every movement was evidence, every breath a confession. Neighbours testified about odd smells from your chimney. Children were asked to point to marks on your skin, and in a grotesque inversion of logic, the more you denied, the guiltier you appeared, because only a witch, they reasoned, could lie so convincingly. You were watched as you prayed. You were stripped and searched for witches' teats where familiars might suckle. Even your pets were examined. Your cat or dog declared an imp, if it so much as looked at you when called. And at the end, if you were found guilty, the sentence came not with fire, but with a rope and a crowd eager for spectacle. There is a certain silence in the records of these hangings. Names without faces. Verdicts without evidence. Lives erased with the flick of a quill. We remember the grand pageantry of Elizabeth's court, the masks, the poems, the plays of Shakespeare, but not the women, led to the noose for nothing more than a handful of herbs or a neighbour's envy. Their stories slip between the golden threads of history. Yet they were as real as the marzipan swans on the Queen's banquet tables. And so the kingdom lived in two worlds at once. In one, the poets wrote of fairies and spirits in enchanted woods, of witches and storms and magic on misty islands. And the crowds laughed and clapped and felt clever for recognizing the metaphors. In the other, real women died for the same words, the same images, the same fears. The theatre of superstition was not confined to the stage. It played out in courts and gallows, in kitchens and fields, in the quiet terror of being called strange. Even among the powerful, no one was entirely safe. A wrong glance, a wrong rumour, a wrong birth defect could summon the old accusation, the one that had haunted queens and commoners alike. And Elizabeth knew this. She knew that to rule was to walk a narrow bridge over a pit of whispers. Perhaps that is why she cultivated such an image of control, of virgin purity, of almost otherworldly composure. She had seen what happened to a woman who seemed too human in her passions. She would not repeat her mother's mistake, yet the laws remained, and the gallows did not stand empty. England's obsession with witchcraft outlived the Queen herself, persisting into later reigns, feeding the dark imagination of a society that called itself enlightened even as it hanged its healers. And beneath it all lay the same old fear. Fear of women's knowledge. Fear of hidden powers. Fear of difference dressed as piety. This is the world you enter when you peel back the velvet curtain of the Elizabethan Golden Age. Not just the sugar rot of smiles or the beaked masks of plague, but the silent terror of being named. To live in that time was to live under a sky where even the Queen's mother could be called a witch, where a finger could be proof of a pact with the devil, where law and superstition were threads of the same rope tightening around a throat. And as we drift deeper into this story, as the candles burn lower and the night presses in, it is worth remembering that superstition does not vanish with time. It only changes shape. In Elizabeth's England, it wore the mask of law. In ours it may wear another, but the whisper is the same. There are few silences more final than that of a corpse. Skin waxy, eyes glazed, limbs stiff with the stillness that no prayer can undo. And yet, in the shadowed corners of Elizabethan England, there existed a belief so strange, so profoundly unsettling, that even the silence of death was not beyond question, for they said the dead could still speak. Not with words, not with movement, but with blood. And if a man stood accused of murder, and the body of the victim began to bleed in his presence, it was not coincidence, nor decay, nor the strange chemistry of rot. It was judgment. Pure and divine, this ritual, known as cruentation, was not only practiced, it was accepted as legal proof in courts that did not yet know the cold logic of science, but understood spectacle, fear, and the terrifying idea that the grave could still answer for injustice. In a society where forensic evidence did not exist, where fingerprints were meaningless and alibis were flimsy, things measured by memory and malice, there was comfort in the drama of cruentation. It made justice visible. It gave the illusion of certainty. Bring the accused before the corpse. Make him touch the wound if it bled. He was guilty. If not, perhaps he lived to walk another day. But most people bled, because bodies rot, because wounds weep, because death is never quite as tidy as the living hope. But they did not see decomposition. They saw punishment from heaven. The blade had failed to stop the spirit. They believed, and the soul still cried out for revenge. They would gather in candlelit chambers where the smell of sickness still clung to the walls, where the body lay stiff upon the table, dressed perhaps in the last clothes it wore in life, a crusted stain marking the place where the knife had entered. And the accused, pale, shaking, forced to step forward. The crowd held their breath. A finger stretched out, a touch, and then a drop, red and wet, sliding down the skin like a tear. That was enough. No further question. The corpse had spoken. This belief was not born in Elizabeth's time, but it thrived there, fed by the same fears that birthed witches and masked doctors. It came from medieval Europe, whispered down through centuries, taking root in courts that preferred divine signs to flawed investigations. It wasn't simply a ritual. It was trial by ordeal. The notion that God would intervene if given the chance, that if a man was innocent, the heaven itself would protect him, and if guilty, the world beyond would betray him. Whether it was fire, water, or blood, these trials were spectacles where the laws of man surrendered to the whims of the divine. And the people believed they needed to. Imagine a mother clutching her murdered son's shirt, tear long since dried, standing behind the magistrate as the accused is brought in. She cannot prove who did it. No one saw, but the boy lies there still. And the priest says the body may yet bear witness. The accused hesitates. He knows what's at stake. The townsfolk lean in, and then the wound opens. And someone screams. The priest crosses himself. The magistrate nods. There is no need for confession. The corpse has delivered its verdict. The crowd disperses with satisfaction. The mother closes her eyes. Of course, not all judges believed. Some doubted, privately, but dared not speak aloud. To question cruentation was to question the very architecture of faith that kept the people loyal. And in a fragile nation still reeling from religious upheaval, where monarchs had risen and fallen over doctrine, few were bold enough to say, "This is nonsense." Even Queen Elizabeth herself, wise though she was, presided over a system that leaned heavily on the theatre of punishment, not its proof. So the trials continued, and blood kept speaking. There are records, faint and faded, of bodies exhumed for the sole purpose of this ritual, buried once, disturbed again. The earth opened, just to place a living man beside a dead one, hoping the rot would reveal the truth. Sometimes, months had passed, the flesh already melting back into the soil, and still they believed. A corpse did not need eyes to see guilt. It did not need breath to condemn. It needed only to bleed. And even when it didn't, the crowd remembered what they wanted. What's more unsettling is that this practice was not confined to the countryside or the superstitious fringes of the kingdom. It appeared in literature, in law, in the writings of scholars and the verses of playwrights. Even Shakespeare, the bard of the age, gives voice to the belief in Henry VI, where a character, upon touching the slain king, cries out, "O gentlemen, see dead Henry's wounds. Open their congealed mouths and bleed afresh." It was not metaphor. It was reflection. Shakespeare did not invent it. He documented it. He wove the madness of his world into lines that still echo centuries later. But the ritual was not foolproof, not even to those who believed. Accused men learned to prepare. Some would bribe the handlers to wipe the wounds clean before they entered. Others would avoid looking directly at the corpse, fearing a flinch might be read as guilt. There are even stories of men so desperate to escape conviction that they cut their own palms before entering, hoping to blame the blood on their own wounds. The more one studies the records, the more it becomes clear this was not a search for truth, but a performance of it, an elaborate dance in which belief mattered more than reality. By the end of the 17th century, the practice began to die, not with a scream, but with a sigh. New ideas were taking root. The Enlightenment whispered of reason. The scientific method crept in through university halls like dawn through a foggy window. Slowly, reluctantly, the courts let go of cruentation. England ceased using it before other nations, but not before centuries of silent witnesses were made to bleed again for justice that may never have existed. And yet, the idea lingers. Not in law, perhaps, but in instinct. There remains something in us, something ancient and trembling that wants to believe the dead are not entirely gone, that they can reach back through the veil and point a finger, that wrongs too deep for the tongue can be revealed in blood. We see it in our stories, in our ghost tales, in the way we speak of places where murder occurred as haunted. The rituals have changed. The courts are cleaner, but the hunger for signs remains. So when you read of Elizabethan justice, do not picture a room filled with lawyers and ledgers. Picture a stone chamber lit by torches, a table stained with old blood, a magistrate clutching a Bible in one hand and a trembling quill in the other, a priest murmuring in Latin, and a corpse silent, still, but not, in their minds, truly dead. This was the world they trusted, a world where the veil between life and death was thin, and the truth could spill from a wound, even after the breath had fled. It is not justice as we know it, but it was theirs. And once upon a time, in a golden age of poetry and plague, the dead were called to speak, and their answer was blood. In a land where kings wore pearls and queens wore fear like perfume, where the streets echoed with plague carts and the cathedrals with incense and whispers, there was a kind of justice that did not belong to men, nor to law, nor even to reason. It belonged to God. Or so they believed. When mortal minds failed, and no witnesses could be found, when no blood bled from a corpse, and no neighbour came forward, England did not close the book. Instead, it opened the gates of heaven and called down a judgment forged not in evidence, but in fire, water, pain, and miracle. This was trial by ordeal. And in Elizabethan England, it was not myth. It was method. They believed God would not allow the innocent to suffer unjustly. That divine will could be revealed not through careful thought, but through the body's reaction to torment. A woman accused of witchcraft might be stripped and bound, cast into a river with rope around her chest and knees. If she floated, it was said the water rejected her. She was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent, but too often drowned. They called it the ducking test. But no child's game was crueler. It was a baptism in reverse one that saved the soul at the expense of the lungs. Water was only the beginning. In other versions of ordeal, the accused might be ordered to carry a red-hot iron bar across a set number of paces, bare-handed, blistering. The wound would be bound and sealed. And days later, the dressing removed in the presence of priests and judges. If the burn had healed cleanly, without infection, then God had intervened and declared innocence. If it festered, bubbled, oozed, guilt was proven by the very body that housed the soul. There was no arguing with the flesh. It had spoken. Sometimes the ordeal was simpler, yet no less brutal. A man might be made to reach into boiling water and retrieve a stone from its depths. Others were told to walk barefoot across burning coals. Some were forced to fast and pray until delirium set in. And in that haze of hunger and fear, hallucinations were interpreted as visions of judgment. These were not punishments after conviction. These were the trials themselves, the gateway to guilt or grace. But the most terrifying truth is not that such trials existed. It is that the people believed in them. Not just the poor, not just the unlearned, but judges, priests, nobility. The idea that pain could purify, that wounds could bear witness, was woven deep into the bones of society. And how could it not be? In a world where illness struck without warning and crops failed without cause, where war was divine punishment, and kings ruled by sacred right. Suffering was not an error. It was a language. To hurt was to be seen. To survive was to be chosen. The logic was circular but seductive. God is just. Therefore, if you are innocent, He will protect you. If you suffer, you must have been guilty. The trial did not uncover the truth. It defined it. The body was no longer just a vessel. It was the courtroom, the jury, the sentence. And this, more than any whip or noose, was the most insidious cruelty of all the transformation of the human form into a battlefield between sin and salvation. In some parts of England, these trials were performed as public theatre. Crowds gathered. Children sat on shoulders. Vendors sold cider and pies, while a man stood barefoot in a circle of hot stones. Weeping, there was no horror that could not be dressed in ceremony. And when the judgment came, whether in a clean wound or a gasp of breathless drowning, the crowd nodded. Justice had been done. God had spoken. Even Shakespeare, ever the mirror to his time, touched upon this quiet madness. In The Merchant of Venice, Portia invokes divine intervention in the courtroom. In King Lear, madness becomes a kind of truth, and always. There is the sense that justice is something distant and cruel, not reasoned but imposed like a storm, like plague, like fire. The theatre knew what the law dared not say, that the people did not seek fairness. They sought clarity, and if that clarity came from suffering, so be it. Of course, the trial by ordeal did not always end in death. Some survived the coals. Some floated and were still spared. But even when the body was unscathed, the soul was marked. A man acquitted by ordeal returned not as a free man, but as one who had stared into the eyes of a crowd waiting to see him break. His neighbours would remember the burns, the screams, the water that rejected or embraced. He had passed the test. But he was never the same. Women fared worse. The ducking stool, in particular, was a weapon aimed almost exclusively at them. It was used not just for witchcraft, but for scolding a charge so vague it might mean gossiping, arguing, refusing a husband's will. To be loud was to be dangerous. To be assertive was to be unnatural. And so, into the river they went, strapped to a seesaw that plunged them beneath the surface again and again. Each gasp of air, a chance to confess. Each mouthful of water, a punishment for speaking. And the people watched, and the people cheered. Some historians claim that by the Elizabethan period, these trials were fading, that the rise of centralized courts and printed laws marked the decline of superstition in legal form. And perhaps, on parchment, that was true, but in the minds of the people in the muddy streets and flickering candles of village halls, the old ways died slowly. Justice did not evolve all at once. It bled out, limb by limb, replaced not by enlightenment, but by exhaustion. There came a time when the wounds stopped healing, and even the judges looked away. And yet, there remains a strange echo of trial by ordeal in the modern world. We no longer cast people into rivers or force iron into their hands, but we still ask the impossible. We ask victims to be calm, to be perfect, to remember every detail. We ask the accused to be silent, to suffer politely, to prove a negative. We still believe that truth can be found in performance. That pain can reveal something hidden, something pure. We no longer call it divine judgment. We call it scrutiny, trial by media, by rumor, by memory. But the bones of it are the same. There is a darkness in every age, a need to see suffering not as a tragedy, but as a tool. In Elizabethan England, they called it justice. They trusted the fire, the water, the blade. They let the body decide, and for a time, they believed that God answered through blisters and bruises. Perhaps they had no choice. Perhaps belief was the only shield they had. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the coals cooled and the wounds festered, one wonders if they ever doubted, if they ever looked into the face of a drowned girl and whispered, "We were wrong." But by then, it was always too late. The river had closed. The iron had cooled. The silence returned. And the record showed justice was done. There are eras in which death arrives like a soldier loud, brutal, marching through fields with sword in hand and smoke in its wake. But the Elizabethan age knew a different kind of death, one that came on silent feet, slipping through alleyways and open windows, coiling itself around throats before anyone could speak its name. They called it plague, but long before they understood its science, they gave it something even more terrifying, a soul. They believed that death moved with the air, that breath itself was betrayal, that behind every stench and every foul breeze was an invisible hand clutching the heart. They called it miasma, the bad air, and to live in that world was to inhale fear with every gasp of life. Cities like London were ripe for such beliefs. Their gutters overflowed with waste. The Thames was a ribbon of filth. The marketplaces bustled not only with trade, but with rot dead animals, spoiled food, the stink of sweat and sickness, all stewing beneath the summer sun. And above it all, the fear that something unseen was watching, waiting. There were no germ theories, no understanding of bacterial infection, no microscopes to show the enemy's face. All they had was smell, and from that sense, they built a kingdom of dread. When plague struck, and it always did, again and again like a dark tide, the city transformed. Doors were painted with red crosses. "Lord, have mercy upon us," written in trembling script above doorways that would never open again. Children vanished from streets. Smoke poured from chimneys where herbs were burned in desperation. And in the fog of that panic, a new figure emerged, one so strange, so haunting, that even now it lingers in the collective memory like a ghost that refuses to fade. The plague doctor, cloaked in black, gloved, silent, and crowned with a mask that looked more bird than man. The beak, that was what made them monstrous. A long, curved beak, protruding like the nose of a scavenger crow. Glass lenses over the eyes. A narrow slit for breath. Inside the beak, they stuffed dried flowers, herbs, spices, and cloth soaked in vinegar. Anything to block out the stench. Anything to protect against the miasma. They believed the sweet smells would purify the air, that the very shape of the mask would redirect the poison, that by dressing as death, they might somehow escape it. It was theatre. It was science. Misunderstood. It was desperation worn as costume. These doctors, if the word can truly apply, were not heroes in the modern sense. Some were physicians, but many were simply paid volunteers, poorly trained and poorly protected. Their job was not to heal. It was to record, to count the dying, to move through infected homes with their long sticks and poke the bodies to see who still stirred. They took pulse with gloved fingers, asked questions through muffled voices, scribbled down names in blackened ledgers, and when they turned away, another window slammed shut. Their presence was a warning. If you saw the beaked man walking down your street, you shut your doors, drew your curtains, and prayed you had burned enough rosemary to keep him from knocking. He did not come with cures. He came with confirmation. If he entered your home, the plague had already won. And when he left, it was not with a promise, but with a tally. They carried canes not for support, but to touch the sick from a distance, to prod wounds, to flip bodies onto their backs. Some carried small bottles of perfume to hold beneath their noses. Others chewed garlic until their mouths burned, hoping the sting would chase away the sickness. They believed that disease could enter through pores, so they sealed their garments tight with wax and leather, sweating beneath the sun, suffocating beneath the mask. But it didn't work. It never did. And yet, they tried, again and again, through outbreak after outbreak. In the year 1563, again in 1592, again and again, the bells rang for the dead. And again the masked men walked the streets, shadows with beaks, counting time in corpses. The people feared them. Children cried at the sight. Adults crossed themselves and whispered prayers. There are stories hard to prove, but impossible to ignore, of plague doctors being attacked in the streets, mistaken for demons, chased from homes with stones and curses. They were necessary. They were hated. They were the closest thing to mercy the city had left. And what of their own deaths? Many perished in silence, buried without ceremony in the very pits they had helped to fill. Others disappeared when the plague faded, shedding their masks like skins, returning to anonymity. Their names are lost, their records scattered, their legacy remembered only in horror. But for a time, they were the face of a kingdom's fear. Not the queen, not the clergy, not the poets, the bird-masked man, moving slowly through streets, lined with shuttered homes and silent prayers. Over time, as medicine advanced, the beak fell out of fashion. Germ theory replaced miasma. Microscopes revealed what noses never could. The masks became curiosities, relics of a darker time, but they never truly vanished. Artists painted them. Playwrights mocked them. Historians whispered their names. And in moments of great sickness, when the world faltered again. Their image returned in Halloween costumes, in conspiracy theories, in nightmares. Because the beaked mask is not just a symbol of disease, it is a symbol of the unknown. It is the fear of the air itself. The fear that what kills us cannot be seen, cannot be heard, cannot be touched, only inhaled. And in a way, that fear never left. Even now, century later, when we lock our doors against invisible threats, when we wear masks of our own and speak in hushed tones about transmission and contagion, the ghost of the plague doctor walks beside us. We no longer believe in miasma, but we still believe the air can betray us. We still believe in distance, in gloves, in silence. So when you see the paintings of Elizabethan grandeur, the ruffs, the pearls, the golden halls, remember also the side streets where the air thickened and the shadows grew long. Remember the hands that bled beneath leather gloves. Remember the glassy eyes behind the beak. Remember that in the heart of the Golden Age, a city was gasping, and its breath was cursed. In every Golden Age, there is a golden mask, and in the age of Elizabeth I, no mask shone brighter, no presence loomed larger than the woman who wore the crown and commanded the loyalty of a nation. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the mother of her people, the eternal flame that lit England's rise to greatness. Her portraits were divine, snow-pale skin, flame-red hair, jewels braided into silk, her hand resting gently upon the globe, gaze firm and immaculate. But behind every painting, behind every coin struck with her profile, behind the myth carefully crafted by poets and courtiers, there was a mouth that she dared not open, a mouth full of pain, of rot, of secrets too bitter to swallow. And when Elizabeth smiled, the nation looked away. She had been a girl of keen wit and sharper survival instinct, born in the year 1533, daughter to Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. Marked from the beginning by scandal and shadow, her mother's head rolled before she could walk, her legitimacy questioned, her safety uncertain. She learned early that to rule was to remain in control of emotion, of image, of the very flesh. But no mask can last forever, and time, like politics, finds its way beneath the skin. By the time she took the throne in 1558, Elizabeth was already a master of perception. She cloaked herself in symbols, the moon, the phoenix, the untouched pearl, each chosen to deflect the world's gaze away from the woman and toward the legend. But the body, however royal, is not made of myth, and Elizabeth's was slowly surrendering to one of the most ironic afflictions of her court decay from sweetness. Like her nobles, the Queen adored sugar, imported from far colonies, moulded into roses and chess pieces, soaked in rosewater and shaped into little bricks that dissolved on the tongue. It was a luxury, a performance, and a quiet addiction. Gingerbread, candied violets, perfumed marzipan. The court was awash in these delights, each bite more refined than the last. Each banquet, a testament to wealth and taste. But sugar was more than indulgence. It was status. To consume it was to show you could afford what others could not. To refuse it was to appear backward, plain, even poor. Elizabeth indulged deeply. She was known to prefer sweetmeats to meats, cakes over bread. Her cooks created confections worthy of poetry. And as the years wore on, so did the price of pleasure. By the middle of her reign, the Queen's teeth had begun to blacken. Her breath, once described as rose-scented, grew foul. She winced when she chewed. Her meals were softened, pureed. In council, she pressed her lips together so tightly. Some thought she was merely contemplating, but others knew she was hiding the dark stumps where teeth had once been. hiding the ulcers, hiding the pain. There were whispers, always whispers. A Spanish ambassador once reported with a sneer that the Queen could hardly speak from the agony in her mouth. Foreign observers noted her reluctance to dine in company. Her closest attendants described the elaborate protocols around her grooming the silence. The screens, the dismissal of anyone whose gaze lingered too long. Her portrait never changed. In paint, she remained forever unspoiled. Her face porcelain smooth. Her lips pale but firm. Her jaw dignified. Artists were instructed to follow approved patterns, established templates of her likeness that ignored the swelling, the weight loss, the tension. In this way, Elizabeth became immortal before she was even dead. But within the court, the truth festered like the wounds in her gums. It is said that one particularly rotted tooth caused her such agony that her surgeons begged to remove it. But she refused. The mere sight of the tools made her tremble. Only when one of her bishops, an elderly man, offered to have one of his own healthy teeth pulled before her as a show of loyalty, did she finally relent. And even then, the tooth was removed in silence, without cry or complaint, as if she could will away the pain by denying it audience. Yet perhaps that was the truest act of Elizabeth's reign, the ability to endure pain and pretend it was power. She ruled not by sword, but by performance. Every procession, every speech, every costume was part of the great illusion. And her smile, or rather, the absence of it, became the most carefully guarded illusion of all. There were no toothbrushes, no dentists, no antibiotics, only clove oil, vinegarensis, and whispered prayers. Court physicians offered little help beyond superstitions and salves. Some still believed that sugar itself was medicinal, that it cleansed the blood, or strengthened the mind. One theory advised rubbing sugar directly on the gums to prevent disease. In truth, it only fed the rot. But the Queen could not stop. She would not stop, because to stop was to show weakness. And Elizabeth had no heir, no husband, no protector. Her power was her person, and that person could never appear broken. In this, she was not alone. Her nobles followed suit. As her teeth blackened, so did theirs from imitation, and from real decay. A courtier with pearly white teeth might be mocked as too clean, too common. Some even blackened their teeth with soot to appear fashionable. To mimic the Queen's disfigurement, and thus flatter her, they destroyed their smiles to gain favour not out of cruelty, but devotion. This was a court that wore masks not only on the face, but in the mouth, and outside the palace. The people watched. They did not see the rot. They saw the shine. The virgin queen, the poet's muse, the warrior on horseback before the armada. They cheered her as she aged, adored her as she lost hair, teeth, and kin. They loved her for what she would never give a marriage. On her, an answer. In her silence, they found myth. In her suffering, they found strength. But behind the closed doors of Whitehall, the truth lingered like a wound that would not heal. As she grew older, her physical decline became harder to hide. Her once fiery hair thinned and dulled, replaced by wigs heavy with pearls and gold thread. Her skin, once carefully painted, cracked beneath the lead-based cosmetics that poisoned more than they preserved. Her hands trembled. Her appetite faded. But still, she stood. Still, she ruled. Still, she summoned her voice from between blackened teeth and commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and silenced rebellion. When she finally died in 1603, after more than 4 decades on the throne, she left behind no children, not diaries, not deathbed, confession, only silence. and a nation stunned by the absence of the woman who had become its soul. The embalmers did their work quickly. Her mouth was closed. Her skin was powdered. Her body was placed in a coffin lined with velvet and regret. The nation wept. The poets wrote. The court shifted. But none opened her mouth again. She had taken her secrets with her. And yet, in every painting, every statue, every coin that bears her face, there is a knowing, a tension in the lips, a tightness in the jaw, as though she is still holding something back, as though behind the elegance there is pain, not just dental, but deeper the ache of holding together a kingdom with nothing but willpower and artifice, the ache of pretending not to bleed. And so she remains, the queen who never married, who never wept in public, who never revealed her wounds, except, perhaps, in her smile. And now the candles have burned low. The banquet has ended. The music has faded. And the corridors of the great Elizabethan court fall silent once more. As they must. As they always do. When the velvet curtains are drawn, and the illusions of empire are folded up and stored in the corners of memory. But before we close this chapter, and let sleep take us gently, or not let us sit a little longer by the fire, and reflect on what we've seen, for this was not a bedtime story in the usual sense. This was no tale of triumph, of kings and queens who lived happily ever after. This was the truth of a golden age, golden only because no one dared to look too closely at the rust beneath. We saw teeth blackened not by time, but by pride, men and women who chose decay over humility, staining their smiles in soot and sugar, because beauty, in that world, was not health, but performance. We saw plague doctors dressed as birds, not out of malice, but out of confusion, their masks filled with herbs and hope, walking among the dead, as if to say, we are trying, even if we do not understand. We saw women dragged into rivers, their bodies weighed against superstition, their silence held up as proof of innocence or guilt. We saw the dead called back into courtrooms, bleeding not from wounds, but from fear. Their silence turned into a verdict. No living mouth dared challenge. We saw a queen. Oh, we saw her well, crowned in pearls, swathed in silk, commanding with eyes as sharp as the blade that once took her mother's head. But when she smiled, we did not smile back. We could not, because what lay behind her lips was not majesty. It was the proof of what indulgence and isolation and the burden of perfect rule can do to a body. It was all a theatre. Every inch of it, from the ducking stools to the crimson-inked laws, from the spice-scented masks to the marzipan sculpted into crowns. The Elizabethan era was a world so terrified of truth that it built an entire civilization out of avoidance. Pain was called piety. Disease was painted over. Women were feared not because they were dangerous, but because they were different, and difference could not be tolerated. It had to be named, condemned, executed, and yet, perhaps, the most terrifying truth of all is this: it worked. The illusion held. The mask stayed on. Elizabeth ruled longer than most kings. Her court produced poetry, theatre, exploration, conquest. Her kingdom feared her, adored her, bent the knee to her. The world remembers her as a symbol of glory, rarely of grief. But grief was there. It always was. Because beneath the lace ruffs and the powdered cheeks, there was rot. Beneath the oaths and declarations, there was panic. And beneath the paintings, those famous, flawless portraits, there was a woman who could no longer chew, no longer sleep without pain, no longer trust her own body to hold up the myth she had become. We measure time in centuries, in rings, in wars. But people do not live that way. They live one breath at a time. One spoonful of sugar, one night of fever, one whispered accusation, one knock at the door. And so, when we speak of an age, the Elizabethan age, we must remember that it was built not just on triumphs and treaties, but on 1,000 quiet horrors that history prefers not to write down. A girl drowning to prove her innocence. A man watching his wound fester, knowing it will be called guilt. A mother watching a plague doctor approach her door. A queen hiding her smile for fear it might unravel a nation. These are not the images on coins or in schoolbooks, but they are real. They lived, they bled, they burned, and yet, for all its fear, the Elizabethan era did not crumble. It endured, it even flourished, not in spite of the fear, but perhaps because of it. Fear is a powerful architect. It builds faster than reason. It enforces obedience where love cannot, and it survives longer than most kings. So what, then, is the lesson for us, the sleepless ones? The late-night thinkers who press play on stories like this because part of us knows that history is the only horror we cannot escape. It is this fear may build an empire, but it cannot heal it, and it never lasts. No matter how many laws are passed, how many rituals performed, how many masks worn, the truth always returns, like breath through cloth, like blood through wounds, like rot through painted teeth. Elizabeth died, the plague passed, the courts were cleaned, the rivers stilled, but the echoes remain. In our systems, in our silences, in the way we still punish those who are different, in the way we still trust spectacle over truth, in the way we still, sometimes, mistake fashion for fact and fear for faith. So let this story end, not with judgment, but with tenderness. Let us light a candle not for the queens or the doctors or the judges, but for the ones whose names were never recorded, the ones whose lives were devoured by superstition, whose deaths were quiet and unjust, whose stories were never meant to be told. Let us remember them. Let us learn from them. And then let us sleep, not in ignorance, but in defiance. Let us close our eyes not to forget, but to carry forward the truth that no empire, no crown, no myth is more important than the body, the breath, the human beside us. Because in the end, it was never the fear that made the era golden. It was the people who endured it,